Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to all of our online participants from across the pond and internationally. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this CSD Policy Roundtable on the future of natural gas in Southeast Europe, on diversification and phase out. As you might know, I'm sitting in for my dear colleague Martin Vladimirov, the Director of our Energy and Climate Program, whom we will all miss, but he has been so kind to prepare talking points for me, which I will deliver promptly, because we're awaited by a wonderful panel. We're facing a very, very precarious and difficult times. The Russian invasion in Ukraine has been a rude wake-up call for Europe to strategically decouple from its excessive dependence on fossil fuel imports from Russia. Southeast Europe in particular is vulnerable to energy and climate security risks, as Russia remains one of the main oil and gas suppliers to the region. I'm very happy to welcome to today's Policy Roundtable some of the most renowned European and US energy policymakers and experts, including Ambassador Jeff Pyatt, Assistant Secretary of Bureau of Energy Resources of the US Department of State, who will join online, Yvonne Slingenberg, the Director for Strategy Analysis and Planning, Directorate General for Climate Action, European Commission, Petr Zeniewski, who joined us in person here, lead gas analyst of the World Energy Outlook International Energy Agency, our dear friend Melanie Kenderdine, principal of the Energy Futures Initiatives, as well as very experienced decision makers and energy policy insiders from Southeast European region, including Devan Dobrev, the chairman of the Committee of Energy and National Assembly of Bulgaria for a number of times, and a former Minister of Energy, Dimitri Lalas, who will join us online from Greece, and our good partner friend, Radu Dudau, who just flew in from Romania, co-founder and director of the Energy Policy Group in Romania. And I'm so happy to see a lot of friends and media specializing on gas here in person. During the discussion, my colleague Constanța Rangelova, a senior analyst at CSD's Energy and Climate Program, who we've grown to know, is going to present a detailed assessment of the long-term visions of security of natural gas supply and the acceleration of fossil fuel phase-out in Southeast Europe. The assessment is building upon CSD's extensive work in creating an energy and climate security risk index, something that we hope will become one of the leading instruments for energy policy making in Europe. It would not have been possible, this roundtable and the report that some of you have seen. You could also download the full version of the report at csd.bg, but it would not have been possible without the key insights from Tim Gould, Chief Energy Economist at the International Energy Agency, our dear colleague Boyko Nitsov, former team lead for gas infrastructure development at the Gas Department of the European Union's Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulation, and Marcello Mazzera, former head of the Security of Supply, Energy Infrastructure and Energy Markets at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, with whom we've had extensive discussions on how we can crack this idea on getting out of fossil fuel gas while at the same time preserving our energy security. And the energy crisis has made this a little bit more complicated than we thought was possible before that. We'd like to also thank the whole team of one of the US most prestigious energy think tank, the Energy Future Initiatives, and more especially our panelists today, Melanie Kenderdine. I mentioned that Melanie was supposed to join us in person, but she got sick, so couldn't do it. But thanks God, we have the online version, so we'll be happy to hear her presentation later on. The gas security scenarios also step on the year-long work with Agora Energiewende, our partners from Germany, and in particular Andreas Graf, Senior Associate on the EU energy policy. The assessment of the regional gas security and phase-out trends would have been also impossible without the valuable insights and data exchange and verification from Dimitri Lalas, who will join us online, and Radu Dudau, who have been great in kind of cross-checking our findings, and we'll continue our discussions because we're in this together, and we look forward to this Euro-Atlantic discussion and focus on Southeast Europe. With that, I think we're good on time. I will ask our great panelists to stick to the to possibly up to maximum of 10 minutes, and I will allow myself to ask you that the time is running out. But I really hope that we could make also time for discussion before 6 p.m. Sofia time, which is, I think, 7 hours back. That means 1 p.m. US East Coast time. With that, I would like to open the conference, and I'm very happy to give the floor to the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, Jeffrey Pyatt, with whom we've discussed the key policy takeaways for Europe and the world from our analysis during a number of meetings, most recently in October 2022, when we presented the Energy and Climate Security Risk Index in DC. Assistant Secretary Pyatt was U.S. Ambassador to Greece and is very well acquainted with the region. I'm very happy that we could have you with us today, Assistant Secretary Pyatt. The floor is yours. I hope we have a good connection and we can have you online.
Great. Thank you very much, Onyan. Wonderful to see everybody, and many, many thanks to CSD for inviting me to be part of this conversation today on an issue that is so important to our transatlantic interests and to our shared interest in the energy transition. As your opening remarks made so clear, that countries of Southeast Europe need no reminders about the risks of being over-reliant on Russia for energy and gas in particular. Indeed, I will always remember vividly from my time in Athens, what Bulgaria experienced last April when it was the first EU member state to face a full cutoff of Russian gas. And I must say, as ambassador in Athens, I was particularly glad to see the deepening cooperation between Greece and Bulgaria during my time in that role, which brought benefits to those two countries, but also to the wider region of Southeastern Europe. As ambassador, I was really pleased to have supported the development of a number of key infrastructure projects, including the Greece-Bulgaria interconnector and the port renovations and floating storage and regasification FSRU at Alexandroupoli, both of which made significant contributions to changing the energy map of Southeastern Europe. I was really delighted to be in Sofia last October as part of my very first trip as Assistant Secretary of State, just after the start of operations for the IGB pipeline, and to see and hear in that setting just how quickly the energy landscape of the region was changing. Having just passed the one-year anniversary of Russia's illegal and brutal invasion, I think the trend lines are now clear in terms of the shifting geopolitics and the international resolve to disentangle ourselves from malign actors, most importantly Russia. And in particular, the efforts that have been undertaken in Southeastern Europe, including the IGB, Alexandroupoli, FSRU, Bulgaria's expanding gas storage facilities, and new gas transit agreements with Turkey and North Macedonia, all look even more important a year into this enterprise. The United States and Europe have the same priorities. We want to diversify energy supply routes and avoid any one supplier being able, again, to weaponize energy. We want to accelerate the deployment of sustainable, clean energy resources. We want to reduce methane emissions and CO2 intensity across the oil and gas supply chains. And we want to promote open and transparent energy markets that benefit our citizens and consumers. So Europe and the United States have the same goals. It's been very impressive to me to see the speed of European decoupling from Russia. And importantly, that includes Bulgaria's recent agreement with Westinghouse on nuclear fuel supply. But Europe is going to continue to need affordable, reliable energy and wants that energy to be as clean as possible. Conversely, Russia is never again going to be seen as a reliable energy supplier, a realization that I think has helped to accelerate Europe's shift towards renewable energy sources. Europe, of course, is also making continued investments that the United States welcomes in alternative sources of both piped and liquefied natural gas, such as the Azeri gas that Bulgaria is accessing through the IGB and the Southern Gas Corridor. For over a decade, the United States has been working with Europe to build energy security by identifying alternative routes, promoting reverse flows, expanding interconnections for natural gas, particularly in Southeastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Globally, LNG volume has quadrupled from 2000 to 2022, with 65% of that growth coming from the United States. The United States has become and will remain for years to come the largest global LNG exporter, with more export facilities coming online in the next couple of years. Import infrastructure is growing as well in Europe, including more regasification facilities and an increasing number of LNG carriers. I should emphasize that in the US view, LNG shipping is also part of the global energy transition. If shipping were a country, it would be among the top 10 CO2 emitters, and I know the industry is working hard on that problem. ENR has had ongoing discussions with leaders in the global shipping industry, many of whom come from Southeastern Europe, all of whom are working on lowering emissions through alternate fuels, new technologies like green hydrogen, carbon capture, and wind assistance. And some of these technologies are going to be improved and scaled by leveraging the incentives in two recent US laws, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. I should say, as an American, I'm very proud of how our LNG producers mobilized in response to the Russian-induced global energy crisis. More than 70 BCM of US LNG was exported to Europe in 2022, more than double what we delivered in 2021. And US LNG export capacity is going to grow by about 50% by 2025. Meanwhile, new FSRUs in Europe will add more import capacity and even more opportunities to diversify natural gas supplies. As important, we're pleased to see US companies' commitment to the decarbonization of their industries through development and deployment of technologies, including carbon capture, utilization and storage, direct air capture, and others. And I know that in Bulgaria, both AES and Contour Global are strongly committed to that goal of decarbonization in their Bulgarian thermal power plants. Another important initiative to make up for the Russia-sized hole in global gas supplies is what the United States has been doing with our European partners through the US-EU Joint Task Force on Energy Security. In particular, the focus there on efficiency, including measures like heat pumps, industrial energy efficiency measures, are vital to European energy security. While I think we're all very satisfied that Europe was able to meet its needs this winter, more remains to be done, and the United States is committed to moving forward in lockstep with our European allies. Again, one of the consequences of Russia's war against Ukraine is that the global commitment to energy transition has accelerated for climate, economic, and energy security reasons. From the United States perspective, supporting both energy security and the clean energy transition are mutually reinforcing. As we say in the United States, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. In the long term, all of us need to drastically accelerate our energy transition. And in addition to supporting decoupling from Russia, we've deepened our cooperation across Southeastern Europe on renewables, on battery storage technologies, on nuclear technologies, including SMRs, and other clean energy options like green hydrogen, all of which I discussed when I was in Sofia last year. The IEA, of course, projects that renewables will surpass coal to become the largest source of global electricity generation by 2025. And all of us need to do more to address the policy, regulatory, permitting, and financial challenges to that transition. We've demonstrated our commitment in the United States through our legislation, in particular the Inflation Reduction Act that I mentioned earlier. And the IRA will incentivize clean energy generation and supply chain and support decarbonization technologies, including CCUS and green hydrogen. Already, since the IRA, the United States has seen $75 billion in new investment in battery technologies, for instance. Last point before I close. I want to note how much we appreciate Southeast Europe's steadfast support for Ukraine. And that continued solidarity will be critical to getting through this crisis. I saw that so vividly in my conversations with Prime Minister Mitsotakis, Foreign Minister Dendias, and the rest of the leadership in Athens. It's been equally true, of course, in the case of Bulgaria, despite very challenging circumstances, including the April 27th Gazprom cutoff. Bulgaria has taken this opportunity to fast track its efforts to diversify natural gas supplies. And I should note, Bulgaria has been an active and supportive participant in our G7 plus effort to defeat Putin's waves of attacks on Ukraine's energy grid. And it's greatly, greatly appreciated. Bulgaria, of course, is already importing gas from Azerbaijan, and it has plans to contract LNG through the Alexandropoli FSRU to meet its remaining demand. All of this is an important example for the rest of Europe, but more work lies ahead. I've already talked about nuclear. There's work to be done on crude oil. Southeast Europe needs to continue to diversify its crude oil imports. Doing so denies the Kremlin the revenue that it uses to support its brutal war. And the US government is committed to partnering with our European allies, including Bulgaria, to help identify secure and sustainable alternative suppliers. We recognize that even renewable energy is not without its own security of supply challenges, especially along the supply chain. And as we navigate the clean energy transition, it's going to be even more important that we develop diverse supplies of increasingly high demand critical minerals and the ability to refine those minerals. Any market, whether it's natural gas, nuclear fuel, or critical minerals that's dominated by a single actor, is not going to provide the competitive, transparent, and sustainable foundations for the clean energy transition that we all want to accelerate. So none of this is to say that the work ahead is going to be easy. The energy transition is going to be more challenging for some countries than for others. There's no doubt about that. But it's also an opportunity for new jobs, for economic growth, and improved air quality. In closing, I just want to reiterate, bolstering energy security has never been more central to national security, and Southeastern Europe is right at the front lines of that effort. But the United States sees the future path of energy diplomacy as an avenue for cooperation, not for conflict. What Bulgaria has been doing over the past few years with IGB, with its communications with Turkey, with its work with North Macedonia, with Greece, all illustrate that principle vividly. The disruptions caused by Russia's war against Ukraine mean that our collaboration with allies and partners like Bulgaria is more important than ever. So I'm delighted to be with you today, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Pyatt. I hope that you will be able to stay a little bit longer with us, so if you'll be able to answer questions.
Of course.
Would that be okay? Thank
Sure.
you. I'm now happy to then give the floor to our next keynote speaker, Yvonne Slingenberg, Director for Strategy, Analysis and Planning and Director General for Climate Action, the European Commission. We've had a number of, our energy and climate team has had a number of discussions with Yvonne over the years on how to best circle square, or how to see, how we could actually reconcile the energy trilemma. Clearly now, energy security comes first as we all gear up to help Ukraine win the war on Europe, which is essentially on the European Union. But I look forward to Yvonne's intervention as to how we could keep our eyes on the bigger picture, on the prize of 2050, and the threat of climate change. Yvonne, the floor is yours, and I hope that you can hear us and that we have a good connection. I can see you talking, but I can't hear you. I hope you're not muted. Not yet. We'll just check also on our side, if there's anything, this is the, but we can't seem to hear you. Okay, so it's almost there. I can hear separate sounds, but we still, it seems that you hear us, right? Okay, let's see if we can do something on our side to check that. Well, I think I could. In the meantime, if I could ask people online and also in the room to think about questions to Ambassador Payet and also to Yvonne on that. Can we try again? Can we have a? No, we don't seem to be able to establish a connection. What I would suggest is, if our tech team here agrees with me, is that we go on and ask Costanza to do the presentation, and then see if we could reestablish the connection in the next 10 minutes. Is that okay, Yvonne? Thank you so much. Thank you. So we'll now then give the floor to my colleague Costanza Rangel, who will present the analysis that we've done for diversification and gas phase out in Southeast Europe. Costanza, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruslan. Let me just see if the slides will appear on screen. Of course, today I have the pleasure of presenting the work that has taken more than a year to do. What we did was we have developed a pilot prototype of an energy and climate security risk index. Okay, here we go. And we use that index to evaluate different scenarios until 2030 and see how well each scenario performs in terms of reducing Southeast Europe's energy and climate security risks. And this is an illustration of our index, which is a data-based policy instrument which looks at different risks related to energy and climate security. And it tries to help us manage and help policymakers in particular manage the trade-offs and synergies between trying to achieve different goals, so minimizing geopolitical risk while at the same time reducing affordability risk and especially energy poverty risks, increasing the reliability of our energy system, and of course the sustainability aspect and lowering our greenhouse gas emissions. And this tool helps us to see how achieving the sustainability goals actually has very much a lot of synergies with reducing geopolitical risk, with increasing affordability, and also what kind of additional efforts we need to make on the reliability side. And the particular focus of today's presentation is one of the key indicators of this index. So it has more than 40 indicators, but this is one of the, let's say, headline indicators, which looks at the security of natural gas imports. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions on the methodology side after the presentation. I just wanted to highlight that this is a risk that looks at diversity of supply, but also import dependency, and also how much the economy of each country is dependent on natural gas. And let's first have a look at what happened over the past several years based on the index. So here we're looking at real life data. Most of the data that we use is from Eurostat to calculate the index results. And what we see is that first, the level of risk has increased significantly since 2014. So what we are seeing, the index telling us, is that between the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and 2021, basically the eve of the war in Ukraine, Europe was growing its dependence on Russian gas, and at the same time increasing significantly the level of risk that it was exposed to in terms of imports of natural gas. And the black line that you see is the EU as a whole, but Southeast Europe is particularly vulnerable, mostly because of its excessive dependence on Russian gas. And Bulgaria has done some, let's say, efforts to diversify, but still the level of risk is significantly higher than the EU average. And in Greece, what we're seeing is a considerable increase of the risk, which coincides with the policy in Greece of increasing the role of natural gas in the power sector, and that goes hand in hand with increasing dependency on Russian gas, also in volumetric terms. And in Romania, we also have relatively lower risk because of natural gas production that they have, but also natural declines there, and the growing role of natural gas in the economy actually led to growing risk also over the past several years. And now we ask ourselves, what can we do to actually reverse this trend of ever-growing risk? And of course, the war in Ukraine was a huge wake-up call for Europe in terms of diversification. But diversification is not enough. We need to aid diversification with managing basically the role of natural gas in the economy of these countries. And we looked at 3 different scenarios. The EU reference scenarios, which is like a baseline scenario, the Fit for 55 scenario, which is also a scenario developed by for the European Commission, and that looks into achieving the European Green Deal objectives, and an accelerated gas phase-out scenario, which is part of another project that we have been working on together with the Gore Energiewende on looking at ways to achieve the Fit for 55 goals and net zero objectives by 2050, while at the same time minimizing the role of natural gas. And in this scenario, we look at the maximum potential for natural gas demand reduction in each country. And here we focus on the results for the 3 countries, so Bulgaria, Greece, and Romania. And what do the results tell us in terms of how each scenario performs in terms of reducing the level of risk for each country? So here you see the percentage change in risk versus 2021. So 2021, of course, is a year of extremely high risk, and this is the reduction that we could have in all of the scenarios for the 3 countries. So in the accelerated gas phase-out scenario, so when we maximize the potential for reducing natural gas demand, we have between 50% and in the case of Romania, 100% reduction of the natural gas import security risk. And the 100% import security risk reduction in Romania, this is because natural gas demand declines enough to make Romania a net exporter of natural gas, also helping other Southeast European countries in that sense, and without investing in additional natural gas production. And in Bulgaria and in Greece, we have lower natural gas demand, actually facilitating and accelerating diversification efforts, leading to this huge risk reduction potential that we have untapped. And I'm saying untapped because if you look at the Fit for 55 results, you can see that the reduction potential is not sufficient, and especially in Greece, where even in the Fit for 55 scenario, we have growing role of natural gas in the power sector, and actually minimum reduction of the risk, even compared to the reference scenario. Now, what are we looking at when we speak about gas demand reduction? Most of it, and let's say the majority of the demand reduction potential that we see is from the building sector, and that's to a large extent because of the rollout of heat pumps and electrification, but also efficiency gains, because Southeast Europe has a huge untapped potential in terms of energy efficiency and reducing natural gas demand by basically reducing the wasting of energy. And in the industry sector, we're looking at a huge transformation where we have at the same time efficiency gains, but also circular economy measures and the rollout of industrial heat pumps for low temperature applications. And all of these measures can lead to a huge reduction of natural gas across all the countries that we studied and lead to lower risk. Now, in addition to looking at the level of risk based on just reduction of demand, we also did an additional assessment. So something in addition to the 3 scenarios, we looked at with the demand and supply balance for each country, what kind of diversification pathways we could find for all these countries based on current plans and developments in each one. And what you see here is our analysis of the diversification pathways for Romania. And as you can see, the zero risk that we have in the accelerated gas phase-out scenario, this is because Romania becomes a net exporter. And in all other scenarios, we still have an import mix that remains dominated by Russia, mostly because the main focus from a government side is on using higher production as a means to reduce risk exposure. Now, moving into the diversification pathways for Bulgaria, we already have, compared to 2021, a huge reduction of the risk related to precisely the startup of the full volume deliveries via Azerbaijan, which is also why in the reference scenario we have a slightly lower risk, even though natural gas demand increases a little bit compared to 2021. But this cannot be compared to the level of risk reduction we can achieve by 2030 with the accelerated gas phase-out scenario. So we have a 50% risk reduction. and a mix that is much more diversified, even though we still have a reliance on Russia in that scenario, which is mostly a reflection of the fact that we still have work to do to reduce our reliance on Russia. And here we take the perspective of a regional dependence on Russia, because even though Bulgaria does not currently import directly from Gazprom, still the level of flows via Turk Stream to Southeast Europe make the whole region more dependent, and this also makes Bulgaria indirectly dependent on this continued flow of Russian gas through Turk Stream. And now finally looking at Greece, this is actually the country which has the most diversified mix as of 2021. And with the accelerated gas phase-out scenario, it could fully replace Russian gas with alternatives without even investing in additional infrastructure. And we still have an enormous reduction potential in terms of demand, which comes both from the industry and from the building sector. Now, what's next? I will be very brief. So I think this became very clear from the presentation. So accelerating the reduction of natural gas demand across Southeast Europe is the most efficient way to really minimize the level of geopolitical risk, both in terms of reducing import dependence in the case of Romania, but also facilitating diversification efforts without additional investments in infrastructure. And we need targeted policies in efficiency in the rollout of heat pumps in buildings, but also for low temperature applications in industry to really fully mobilize this potential, because current policies are not sufficient to realize this accelerated gas phase-out scenario projections. And we also need a faster uptake of renewables and avoid gas lock-in in the power sector. As you can see, this approach in Greece actually leads to a significant risk increase compared to the reference scenario even. And finally, just a few words on the energy security from an energy poverty perspective. So when we are doing the
Can you hear me now?
And empowering, basically what we need to do is to make sure that when we do the energy transition in Southeast Europe, we need to take care of energy poor consumers and make sure that they're at the core of this transition and that it is used to empower them. And also we need a transformational shift in the industry sector, and we must not underestimate the challenge that it will be to realize that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Constanza. And I believe I heard Yvonne say something, so hopefully we can have it online. I would ask the people in the hall to please join us at the round table, because we'll have, after Yvonne's presentation, we'll have Ambassador Payet for until 2025 past the hour, so we could have and think about your questions if you have some, also for Yvonne and Constanza, and then we'll continue with the panel. Can we now get Yvonne online? Yvonne, the floor is yours if you could hear us, and I hope we can hear you this time.
Exactly. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you. Please
we did some
forward.
testing, so that's where you heard me say something. Thanks a lot to your colleagues for making this possible. It's always a bit of a challenge with different systems. So thank you so much for inviting the European Commission to your high-level roundtable on the future of natural gas in Southeast Europe. And I also want to start with recalling the illegal aggression of the Russian Federation on Ukraine. And that, of course, really put the spotlight on the strong dependency of the EU energy system on imported fossil fuels. And of course, here again, in particular, natural gas. And at the same time, I think in Europe, it really contributed to the realization that, you know, decarbonization and the acceleration of the phase out of fossil fuels is essential in order to improve our energy and climate security in Europe. You are right. I think you said it in the beginning. I mean, energy security has become a main concern. And that was in particular the case for the winter that we're kind of moving out of right now, although it's still quite cold in Brussels. And of course, the whole purpose was to address the risks that came with that, concern about energy security. We launched in March last year what we call the Repower EU Plan. And there we really showcased, the strong resolve to ending this dependence on Russian fossil fuels, and at the same time, hand in hand, tackling the climate crisis. So again, acceleration of energy efficiency, scaling up the rollout of renewables, but also, diversification of supply, obviously, and reducing consumption also of fossil fuels. I think both in industry, citizens, and transport has been very, very useful in that regard. Now, we see some results of it. Fortunately, 1 year later, we have indeed, to a large extent, been able to decouple from the Russian gas. It used to be 40% of all gas imports in Europe, and we're now at 8%. So that is a really good progress. We have been looking for other suppliers or diversification, but we've also been really diving into new approaches. And here I would like to mention a common EU storage policy, which was really targeting, the past winter, as I said, coordinated gas demand reduction. And we are going to be prolonging that for the next winter as well, because we know that will also still be quite challenging. Now, renewable energy is clearly a very important part also in this transition, and I think that is all the more so because we don't want to move from one, unreliable source of gas supply to another more trusted source of natural gas. It is really all about, leveraging Europe's energy independence, and we can do that by massively increasing renewables and thereby accelerating the climate transition. So fortunately, we saw last year much more electricity from wind and solar being generated than from gas. At the same time, this has also, or the whole situation that I was just describing has had quite important impacts in terms of, very high prices, scarcity of gas availability. And this, of course, hand in hand with, the heat waves and the droughts that we have been experiencing, has been really also the trigger for, some increased use of coal-fired capacity in Europe. And I think we've seen these trends replicated also in the southeast of Europe. We saw at the end of last year, gas generation decreasing, coal and lignite generation increasing a bit, not hugely, but nevertheless. And this still then represents, around a third of electricity generation in the region. Now, in our view, and I think this is backed up by, for example, the ENTSO-E adequacy assessment, it's a bit of a temporary phenomenon, this increased use of coal and lignite. We see since the beginning of this year already a decrease in the prices of gas. So that, of course, will, make the business case for continued use of coal much less clear. Actually, the opposite. And I think also the adequacy assessment shows that there is not really a security of supply issue for the Southeast European region. So that is actually quite reassuring. And that also means that, the opportunities, again, for reducing the reliance on fossil fuels are really quite compelling. Deployment of renewable storage, flexibility solutions all need to be brought into the energy system in the region. And there is huge potential for that also. So that is actually really encouraging. Of course, from my angle, being in DG Climate Action in the European Commission, in any case, all of this needs to really be looked at in the context of our overall transition in Europe towards climate neutrality. This is a legally binding objective in our European climate law. We have our intermediary steps. We have minus 55% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2030. And, these crises that have happened and that we're still, of course, trying to grapple with to some extent, have to be seen in this context, because really the acceleration of the clean energy transition is the solution, as we said, also to all of this. Now, we're very happy, and I think others have mentioned it, that by now the different policy proposals that we have put forward in the context of the Fit for 55 package have more or less all been adopted. Some of them formal adoption just today around lunchtime, so that is really good. And I think it provides this very, very clear regulatory framework for this transition to take place in. I would just like to mention one relatively new kid on the block. It's our Green Deal Industrial Plan that was proposed last week, and a Net Zero Industry Act. Also there, we really want to point to the fact that, the transition to a climate neutral economy basically represents a huge opportunity for many sectors. The clean energy technologies, manufacturing that supports these clean energy technologies will really be very important for the European industry to remain competitive and innovative. So you may have seen in those acts we propose for at least 40% of manufacturing capacity for these technologies to take place in Europe, and that again, should hopefully translate into opportunities for Europe industry and also in the Southeast European region. Yeah, I think I want to mention there that, this comes with lots of recommendations also in terms of simpler and faster permitting, preferred access, which is all about, public procurement, but also auctions really for example, green hydrogen. And we really want to kind of combine all these different tools in order to accelerate the take-up. In all this, cooperation is, in our view, very, very important, notably from neighboring countries. And of course, your conference today is an excellent feature in that, between Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece, how to tackle these different challenges and opportunities, and to really see how to tap into what is going to be opportunities for the region. I want to make a special mention of the Innovation Fund that we kind of are responsible for in DG Climate Action, where we have and we start seeing also projects coming in from Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece. There is already one project that was awarded under the second large-scale call of carbon-free cement. So that is, of course, very, very encouraging, but there will be further calls coming. And we really encourage, also each of the countries to work with us to put forward very good projects in that regard. And again, as I said, we will be putting forward also in the future auctions in this context, and notably for green hydrogen. Now, let me just combine this with a call on, let's say, the authorities. The authorities need to update their national energy and climate plans in order to incorporate the new ambition that we have agreed in the Fit for 55 context. This needs to happen by the summer. And we really call on member states to look at this from a cross, how shall I say, cross-pillar perspective. You may know that in the Energy Union, we have 5 pillars or 5 dimensions. One is decarbonization, one is energy efficiency, one is the internal energy market, then security of supply, but also research and competitiveness. So this is really what we ask from member states is to, work with different ministries to look at the opportunities there, also in terms of EU funding, to work with stakeholders as to, how to combine efforts and insights in, the increase of security of supply, regional cooperation, industrial decarbonization projects, et cetera, et cetera. And we're very happy that we were told by the different authorities that both Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece will cooperate in their proposals under this updated energy and climate plans on the regional dimension. So that's a very good thing. But we also want to emphasize that, these climate and energy plans will be very important for investors. It will really provide the direction of travel, the certainty in terms of where investments will be going, and that will help mobilize such investments, towards 2030, but also beyond. And that is where the planning on the side of member states in a cross-cutting manner will be so important. Now, public funds are fortunately also available to a fairly large extent. We have a whole series of different EU funds and EU instruments where, frankly, the 3 countries in the conference today are, benefiting from a lot of financial support. I just want to mention the Recovery and Resilience Facility, now topped up with the Repower additional money. And I just tried to put some figures together here, but for Bulgaria, that basically means the RRF and the Repower together around 6 billion euros in grants. For Greece, around 18 billion in grants and 12 billion in loans are foreseen as well. And then for Romania, 13.5 billion in grants and another 15 billion in loans. So, this is a huge amount of money. And I haven't even mentioned yet the ETS revenues. So the revenues from auctioning under the emissions trading system, where also a lot of money is flowing into member states. And this has really got to be used for the right purposes, also tapping into, the Innovation Fund, as I mentioned, The modernization fund, I will not give the figures for each of these funds, but really, if you look at it together, there is a lot of money. Now, of course, the transition comes with social implications. We will need to look at the necessary skills also, and of course, to protect the vulnerable parts of society. And in that respect, I want to mention that also as part of the Fit for 55 package, a new social climate fund has been agreed upon. That should come into being in 2026, and that will really target, the vulnerable households, transport users, and micro enterprises. And here as well, the three countries are huge beneficiaries, in fact, disproportionately so, because there is quite still a lot of energy poverty and transport poverty. There is a just transition mechanism as well as at European level, which is, of course, targeting specifically the most affected regions in order to try and stimulate a fair transition also in those regions. And then, of course, there are the structural funds, which I think are a well-known element of EU policy and EU funding. Now, let me conclude by saying that, and that is also the fact why we're very happy to be in this conference here this afternoon, energy and climate policy, and I think Mr. Pyatt also said the same, really go hand in hand. It's completely interlinked. A decarbonized energy system is a necessary building block to get to climate neutrality. To even contemplate us getting there, you need to decarbonize the energy system. We need to look at, targeted interventions in this sector and to try and have a managed transition away from fossil fuels, not to have this, disruptive or volatile approach, but to manage this transition. And I really hope, of course, that the Southeast European region will be at the forefront. Again, as I said in the beginning, the war in Ukraine has put the spotlight onto all of this, the resilience of the energy system. But yeah, I think, energy security, energy independence, and the different tools we have are going to be very important in the respect. And let me just mention that, we are very happy to learn more about the energy and climate security risk index, looking at all the different dimensions there, because we think that can be really a useful and important tool, again, for member states and different stakeholders to gain more insight on the factors at stake, how to shape the policy so that we can have this energy independence as well as the decarbonization away from fossil fuels. We do have, we have made progress, but we also, I think, all know that we still have a tough job ahead of us. So we need to work together to do that. And I think, it can also set a very good example. The actions in the Southeast European region can also set a very good example for the wider region. And here I'm thinking of the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova, who after all also have commitments to engage in this transition, but will also have challenges there. So the more we can work on plans and tools, also carbon pricing, that will be hugely beneficial. And hopefully in that way, we can kind of create a race to the top, seizing the opportunities that are there from the transition, and thereby increase our security, our independence, but also our competitiveness and the transition to climate neutrality. And it sounds very similar to what Mr. Pyatt was saying, but when I listened to him, I was like, yes, that was also my closing. So really to work on these things hand in hand and to make forward together, but moving away from fossil fuels. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. I hope you could stay with us for a little bit more time so that we could get a discussion. I know Ambassador Pyatt is 7 more minutes with us, so I'd like to benefit from his presence and ask him some follow-up questions. I don't know if somebody from the audience wants to ask a question. We have 2 questions from the chat in Zoom that I'm going to ask. These have been 3 great presentations, and I believe what Yvonne just spelled out was that we have tons of money, essentially, including both grants and cheap loans. And the question is, how do we prioritize that? Because these are very, they're still insufficient if we don't have the private sector on board. And to get the private sector on board means we have to have a very clear long-term perspective. And somehow I get the idea that in the region here, despite the fact that we've gotten some things right, there is a lot of uncertainty as to the long-term vision of when, how, and in what respect are we going to have the exit from fossil fuel. And here, just 2 follow-on questions to Ambassador Pyatt. One was, You mentioned the US-EU joint task force on energy, and I believe CSD was part of some of the groups there. I think it's a great initiative. I think essentially that the Ukraine crisis has shown that if we as the collective West need to work out on these long-term climate goals, we need to find a way to bring in also our competitors, adversaries, or however you want to, the EU or the US want to call Russia, but also China in the long term. And that's the more broader question, but there are two specific questions, Ambassador Payet. One is, can you comment on China's reopening and what that could mean for gas prices and security of supply, given that the increase in EU LNG imports largely matched the decline in Asia, and that decline is temporary in light of China's reopening and long-term demand? That's a question from Dan Byers. And the second one from Luka Dimitrov from the ICIS. Is there a US gas LNG strategy for the Balkan region, in particular Albania, Serbia, Croatia, and North Macedonia? What is the appetite for US LNG suppliers to enter those markets and to forge upcoming long-term deals? And I know that Melvin Kenderdan is going to also talk from the global perspective. So Ambassador Payet, if you could hear us, the floor is yours for as long as you can stay with us. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ognan. And I'm happy to do some quick follow-up questions too. So I'll try to be telegraphic on this. Let me start on the Western Balkans, which is critically important, and Bulgaria has been a big part of that story. The answer to the question is yes. We see gas and LNG as a key aspect of our shared interest, the United States and the European Union, in facilitating energy transition and decarbonization in the Western Balkans, a region that has been particularly dependent over the years on Russia. That's why the Alexandropoli project is so important. And I was really proud that one of my last acts as ambassador was to be in Alexandropoli at the beginning of May with President Michel, with Prime Minister Mitsotakis, but also with the prime ministers of North Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Serbia, because that is a truly regional project with both Serbia and North Macedonia being contracted off-takers and a clear intention of all the regional players to leverage the Alexandropoli FSRU as a mechanism to reduce dependence on Russian gas and develop alternatives looking to global markets. We're also very supportive of the pipeline connection, the gas pipeline between Greece and North Macedonia. And once that project is completed, and you have a reliable gas connection to North Macedonia, it's relatively simple, something that I've discussed with Prime Minister Kirti and others, to begin gasification of the energy grid in Kosovo. Likewise, our ambassador in Albania has been very active working with American companies on opportunities for LNG there. Of course, we put a lot of US government energy behind the Kirk Island FSRU project in Croatia. So we see gas in the Western Balkans as a key element of the transition for energy security off of dependence on Russia, also the transition away from coal and more polluting fossil options, and as a catalyst to deeper interconnectivity for renewables. And there's been great progress, for instance, between Albania and Greece, where you can take advantage also of the seasonality, that Albania's increase in hydro capacity during the summertime coincides with the spike in demand that Greece experiences as the tourism economy grows every summer. So we take a very strong regional approach to these issues, and I'm very, very proud of our cooperation with Brussels on this. I should say on the Brussels point, and thank you for mentioning my comment about the task force, I'd also note I'm going to be in Brussels with Secretary of State Blinken on Tuesday for the next meeting of the US-EU Energy Council. This will be the first meeting of the Energy Council since the invasion of Ukraine, and it reinforces the commitment that the United States has to the strongest possible energy and energy security partnership with our European allies. And then on China, just very briefly, I'll say two things. One, over the long term, critically important that we all work with China on issues of energy transition and climate. China is, of course, the world's largest CO2 emitter and needs to make choices about its own future energy pathway. I was in Pakistan recently, where China continues to build very large coal-fired power plants, contributing further to our climate crisis. So we need to continue that conversation. On the question of what's going to happen with markets, one thing I've learned in this job is that markets go up and markets go down, and governments can have relatively modest impacts sometimes. But what I would note here is the significant volume of additional gas that's going to come into global markets, in part because of what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Qatar. But I would also note the opportunity we have as we accelerate energy transition to facilitate additional gas exports, for instance, in Europe, where gas is clearly a transitional fuel. Those molecules will be freed up over the longer term for other markets. And again, coming off of recent travels in South Asia, one is reminded that the world is going to need all the energy sources that it can find over the next decades, as literally billions of citizens in Africa, in South Asia, and Southeast Asia come into the middle class and are going to need all the energy sources that they can find. Our interest is to see that energy demand is filled in the least carbon intensive way possible. Whether that is wind, solar, small modular reactors, green hydrogen, abated LNG and gas. All of these are going to be part of the mix. And I should have emphasized, and I think I alluded briefly in my remarks as well, to the importance of carbon capture and sequestration in the US strategy for meeting our own climate goals. But this also is going to be an important element of how we meet that rising global demand. So a couple of quick answers there. I think I've got time for one other round of questions if you want to fire away.
I don't see any questions in the room. If there's any would be anyone raise a hand, or I don't see also any questions online. But thank you so much, Ambassador Payet, for being with us, and that's really a wonderful perspective. I wanted to actually follow on with Yvonne with the same question on China. Now that we've seen China reopening, what do you think is going to be the impact on gas for Europe, or gas prices for Europe, and whether this is going to have an impact on the strategy of the use of gas in the European Union, and then particularly how does the European Union look into engaging with China on climate neutrality? Yvonne?
Thank you very much, Ruslan. Indeed, a very important question, and of course, many different geopolitical, aspects to that. But I think it's very clear that the reopening, as you call it, will mean that a major buyer for gas is going to come back into play here, and I think it kind of reinforces our resolve that we need to continue our transition, away from fossil fuels. So of course we always also saw gas as a bridge towards renewables, and it can continue to be that in certain aspects. But I think in certain regions as well, where there is this huge potential for renewables, I mean, one can also leapfrog towards renewables more fast, rather than going through this bridging periods. And I think that is what really in the region in Southeast Europe is now at play. And again, the different factors, be it the war in Ukraine, be it China opening up again, is an important element in that. And I think it is all about the mid to long-term perspective. Where is it that we want to go? It brings us back again to the investment question. Of course, I mentioned all the EU funds, but there's also the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So as long as the country priorities and the policies are clear, I think it is possible to attract the necessary investments. And that should be part of the broader policy considerations and the commitments basically of Europe and of the member states to become climate neutral. So Even gas can, to some extent, be, you know, a stranded asset if it's not at least hydrogen ready or carbon capture and storage ready. So all these things need to be taken into account. And then the other angle is absolutely our interaction with China. I think there was a discussion again between my Executive Vice President Timmermans and China, the Chinese representatives, yesterday. Of course, it will be absolutely crucial that we keep discussing with China on their engagement in phasing out fossil fuels. You know, that will be, again, a big topic at the next Conference of the Parties that will take place in the United Arab Emirates. And that is a discussion we need to have with our fossil fuel suppliers, but also, for example, with countries in Africa that see resources that they could be going for, but we're trying to give them a perspective of, you know, also, again, this mid to long term, going rather for, you know, the decarbonized options, renewables, but also green hydrogen. So that is the discussions we have with China and with many others. And yeah, we're in this together, as Sir Piet also said.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Now I would like to continue with the panel. We have a great ongoing panel. It's I will defer the questions to the end. I'm sorry about that, but we have 6 minutes per panelist, and I know that Melanie, who joined us with acute ear infection from DC, she couldn't travel. I hope she could hear us. She has a great presentation on gas. The Energy Futures Initiative just finished or finishes a global gas study, including with implications on all the different regions in the world, and how we're gonna try to exit with that. So I look forward to Melanie's presentation. Melanie, if you could hear me and keep it to 6 minutes, I know it's extremely difficult, but that will be very, very much appreciated. Thank you. Melanie?
So, Ruslan, you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Yeah, nod your head. Sorry. Let me share my screen here. Okay, great. Thank you. It's already taking off. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Democracy, my dear friends there, to our co-host for inviting me to speak, and thank you all for joining us. I'm sorry for not making it. I was very sick. I have infections in both ears. I can't hear, but I can speak. Okay, so I'm going to start with net zero coverage. As of June 2022, net zero coverage in the world covers 83% of emissions, 91% of GDP, and 80% of the world's populations. 128 countries have net zero targets. Importantly, also 702 publicly listed companies. And so the companies, investors are looking at net zero targets too. And I show you this slide to emphasize a critical point. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has driven home. Going forward, climate change and energy security need to be part of the same conversation. It also shows the importance of natural gas to energy security, reliability, the economy, and the need for thoughtful sequence policies for both deep decarbonization and energy security. And I'm going to show you some data to inform those policies, those sequence policies. This is Southeast Europe gas demand, 1990 to 2021. The earlier discussion about reducing natural gas demand, that's important, but in Southeast Europe, that already occurred. You can see from 1990 to 1995, a big reduction in gas demand. I looked to find out what the reason for that was. I assume it had something to do with the breakup of the Soviet Union, but I couldn't find any details. But in 1990, Romania's gas demand was approximately 35 billion cubic meters. and in 2021, 13 BCM. Bulgaria, 5 BCM, not as big a reduction, but not as big demand either, down to 3 BCM in 2021. On the flip side, you can see Greece, 1.5 BCM in 2000. They didn't use any gas in 1990. And they are up to 7 BCM in 2021. So this is just to provide some perspective. All the other countries are relatively flat, but the big changes were there. You all know this story here. This is Russian natural gas demand flows to the EU, January 2019 to July 2022. And it went from 100 million cubic meters a day to, I can't read it. I'm sorry. Something covering my screen. Anyway, these are lower Russian pipe gas flows to Europe and how it was compensated. And you can see here the year-on-year changes of 2020 to 21 compared to 21 to 22. And there you see Russian down approximately 22 BCM. Other gas supply up approximately 2 BCM. Down, others down 1 BCM. And here's the big kahuna. United States up 19 BCM, gutter up 1, and others up approximately 7 BCM. So interestingly enough, supplies were down in that time period by 23 BCM. They were up by 27 BCM. I am sure that helped gas storage and getting through the winter. I'm going to switch here to North American gas, and the US was absolutely instrumental in helping Europe meet its gas demand. And this is what's happened in the US in a year, and I'll explain the year. These are FERC, that's our regulatory agency, approved LNG export facilities under construction. 11.9 BCF a day. This is as of 2 months ago, so very recent. Approved not under construction, 19.1 BCF a day. I testified before the US Senate Energy Committee a year ago. A year ago, approved under construction was 3.6 BCF a day. So approved under construction has increased by over almost 300% in the course of a year. So we are rapidly increasing our export capacity to support our allies and trading partners. One thing I would say to put some further context onto this discussion, when Russia invaded Ukraine and the Biden administration announced it was going to get exports of LNG to Europe, I was having a workshop with the Asian partners on LNG coincidentally at that time. And the Asian partners, our trading partners and allies, were very concerned at that time. What about us? We need LNG from the US as well. So this increase here to 11.9 BCF a day is very important, both for Europe and for our trading partners. This is what's happened to US LNG exports to Europe, and an increase between 2020 and 22. And so France up 400%, Belgium 344, Portugal, Netherlands, Spain, all of Europe up 304% in a 2-year period. In 2020, Europe as a percent of US LNG exports was 45%. In 2022, 67%. So again, the US has stepped in, and it's important. I would actually note that it's due to shale gas development, and we're now the largest. The ambassador or the assistant secretary said largest exporter of natural gas in the world. That is basically due to the shale gas revolution in the United States. These are the LNG supply and demand balances for the following countries and regions. And so here you have 2022, the supply demand balance, meaning the 390 million tons of demand, 401 million tons of supply, a difference of 2.8%. Look at 2023, very, very tight. I know IEA has been warning about this, 1.4% difference. It is only 6 million tons of LNG difference between demand and supply. It gets a little better in the 2024 outlook, 2%, but still it's only 9 million tons, the difference between supply and demand. So markets could be disrupted fairly easily with those kinds of tight differences between supply and demand. These are prices as of January 2023. Not surprising, there's TTF in Europe at $20, JKM in Asia, $24. That's a big driver there, a big difference, could attract more LNG. And Henry Hub there at 330. I think it's gone down even more since January. And so our prices have declined dramatically. These are LNG deliveries by contract type. 71% are long-term, 2% midterm, 27% spot. That is expected to grow substantially, and that could have a paradigm shift for Europe's exposure to LNG spot markets. 2021 exposure was 20% to spot markets. Exposure by 2023 is expected to be about 48%. So a lot of volatility, exposure to gas markets, spot markets, and could have an impact on prices, availability, et cetera, et cetera. Switch now to Europe and its production of natural gas.
Melanie, if you could hear me, can you wrap up in a minute? If you could hear me, if you can wrap up in a minute, and we'll continue then, because we're running out of time.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Okay, yep, sorry. I was told 15, Ruslan. I timed it. So let me go through this. Existing under construction, only 2 existing, one in Southeast Europe, and that's in the Black Sea, and all the rest in development are in the North Sea. This is import terminal capacity as of April 2022. 25% of Europe's new announced LNG import capacity is in Eastern Europe. And so the next, and that's 33.7 BCM. That's a little over a third of what Germany is building in import capacity. And one thing I would say about this in the next slides is it raises the issue of stranded assets. Yvonne raised that earlier, and these are all raising issues of stranded assets. These are operational import terminals. These are operational where expansions are planned. Under construction, only 2 under construction, and there are 10 that are planned. So just a brief picture. These are the length of natural gas pipelines by country proposed and under construction in Eastern Europe. And what you're seeing here, the existing pipelines in Eastern Europe are 39% of the total. They are 67% of proposed or under construction. So Eastern Europe is building pipelines and again runs the risk of stranded assets. And the top four are Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece. The pre-construction of gas plants, again, another stranded asset issue, and announced 21% pre-construction, 70%, under construction 9%. And the biggest announced are Germany and Serbia. Pre-construction, look at the UK there. That's the green lumber there. Italy, Belgium, Poland, Greece, Germany, and under construction, Germany's the largest, Italy second largest. So again, huge interest in and investments in infrastructure and supply, and the risk of stranding those assets, underscoring the need for the sequence policies that I mentioned earlier. And then finally, this is the emissions from the LNG supply chain. So it's only not talking about combustion and use of natural gas, but the other emissions: upstream gas production, 50%, liquefaction emissions, shipping emissions, 16%. Regas is only 1% of emissions, so relatively low emissions for importing countries in Europe and elsewhere. So thank you very much, and hope I stayed within my 15 minutes. Thank you. Thanks.
You did, Melanie. Thank you. It was me that didn't calculate all the minutes, but we have 4 more speakers. But thanks again for that wonderful overview. And we actually look forward to having you in June again in Europe, when we could talk again in detail, because what you seem to point out about the stranded asset, I'd like to hear from our next speakers as to how much, the sequencing and the policy action that we're going to see over the years. And Yvonne mentioned here that we need to have the hydrogen and SSC ready infrastructure if these are not going to be stranded. And the question is again, how are going to these investments happen for that to materialize? Now, I'd like to ask our next speakers again to try to keep it under 5 minutes or 5 or 6 minutes. I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to squeeze that time, but I think we had a great overview, and I think it's important to have the global picture while we're taking the decisions here in Southeast Europe. And now it's my pleasure to turn the floor to Dr. Petr Zaniewski, lead gas analyst and author of the World Energy Outlook and the International Energy Agency. Petr, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ruslan. And indeed, I'll do my best to get it down to a very, very short presentation. So with that in mind, I'll kick it right off. So of course, the context of Russia's invasion really upended energy markets globally. But really nowhere is that more acute or visible than in gas prices in the European Union. So before the invasion, Russia was the largest oil and gas exporter globally, 50% higher than the next largest, which was Saudi Arabia, if you count oil and gas together. And Europe was, of course, Russia's main customer for those flows. So severing that artery of trade really explains that huge run-up in prices and the disruption to energy flows that you saw after that. And of course, the supply shock had deep effects on demand in Europe. And so recently, we tried to break down the factors because there's been a lot of debate about how lucky we were in the European Union with the weather against other factors like behavioral change or production curtailment in industry. And we've tried to break down and assess and measure some of those drivers to inform policy and to inform further analysis on what needs to happen going forward. So as we've seen, weather effects had a really large impact on building energy use. But if we counteract that with the very dry summer that we had, that reduced hydro availability, the marginal effect of weather was actually reasonably small when you take it as a net effect. Less nuclear energy was, of course, a very acute problem in Europe and remains largely so, as a lot of French nuclear reactors remain offline. But significantly as well, we looked at the structural changes to demand in Europe and found that more renewables and efficiency have a durable impact on gas demand going forward. And in 2022 alone, 50 gigawatts of wind and solar were added. That removed the need for about 11 BCM of natural gas, and that was done more or less permanently. So more investment in deployment of those clean energy technologies are required to see the structural demand reductions that we need in the European Union. Now, of course, 2022 was an exceptional year for prices, which meant that it was an exceptional year for costs to the European Union of its gas imports. Russia had a smaller part of that pie, but because the prices were so high, it meant that record revenue accrued to Russia over the period 2022. Now, volumes are down below 10%, as was mentioned. Prices have come down from their record highs. We're about $12 per MBTU now in TTF, still higher than we've seen in the past, but significantly lower revenue is accruing to Russia as we move into 2023. So where do we go from here after that quick review of 2022? Next slide. There we go. Oops. So at the IEA and in the World Energy Outlook, we look at things through the lens of scenarios. And if we take a scenario where the European Union meets its Fit for 55 targets, as well as a large proportion of its Repower EU ambitions, we find that Russian gas can be structurally reduced before 2030 through a variety of levers. Now, those levers were mentioned today. Wind and solar does a lot of the heavy lifting. Building efficiency, which includes the rollout of heat pumps. We saw 3 million heat pumps installed last year, 40% growth in the EU. More of that more or less covers about half of the reduction required to fully displace Russian gas supply, pipeline gas supply in Europe over the long term. On the supply side, we see large interest and investment, growing investment, and a swelling project pipeline for hydrogen, and likewise for biomethane supply, ambitious targets to reach 35 BCM by 2030 for biomethane. Alongside that, we see large amounts of LNG covering off the fallen Russian gas pipelines. We expect that to continue, but also more incremental volume coming from new projects in Africa and the Middle East, specifically in Qatar. So this is what the balance could look like if the EU delivers on those targets. Now, I've pulled this out to show the monthly balance, just to reiterate the significant importance of gas storage, even in a scenario where building energy demand is reducing quite rapidly, and we see a 30% decrease in gas use in buildings in the announced pledges scenario. You still need quite significant volumes of gas in storage. As you move into the 2030s, however, that storage requirement starts to diminish, and you see a lot more of the near-term flexibility required in that scenario being met by LNG. Now, what implications does that have for Europe, specifically in the current context? So this shows you where we currently stand in our contractual balance in the European Union. And I've kind of made Russian contracts a bit transparent there because a lot of them are no longer being met. But really what it does is set out the uncertainty over the next decade and a bit to show really where new supply contracts might be required. If you believe that the European Union can bring gas demand down to the levels envisioned by Repower EU and by Fit for 55, then the additional contractual requirement remains relatively small in the long term, but is relatively large in the near term. And that's even more true if we take our stated policy scenario, which takes today's policy settings and doesn't necessarily incorporate the net zero ambitions insofar as they aren't backed by concrete implementation plans. And there you see an even larger supply gap forming and an even larger requirement contracts. And as Ms. Kenderdine showed before, the EU would be exposed to significant volatility if it remained in the spot market over the next several years. If 50% of volumes are met by spot trading, then that would expose the EU to the near-term pressure on LNG markets through the relatively barren period we expect for new projects over the next 2 years. Beyond that, it really depends on commitments made elsewhere, on Chinese gas demand and LNG demand specifically, for how tight global gas markets might become. But it's surely one of the issues is to secure that long-term volume without compromising on climate targets or on security of supply goals. And with that, I'll return it to you, Ruslan, and I hope I did okay there.
You did great. Thank you so much indeed, Peter, for doing that. Now I'll turn the floor to Milan Dobrev, who is a policymaker in campaign. We have elections on Sunday. So I will be very happy to hear his takeaway. And thank you again for being with us and for being short. It's really important also how, after you will hear from our 2 other partners from Greece and Romania, what the policy takeaways can be from that discussion. Thank you. Milan.
Thank you very much, Ruslan, and thank you for the invitation. I have good news for you. I knew that I wouldn't have much time, so I didn't do a presentation. But all the presentations were very interesting, and just want to add 2 things. One is that it turns out that Bulgaria is in a good place because with phasing out gas, we don't need to invest heavily in domestic gasification. You know that we have only 3% domestic gasification, but the interesting thing is that on the one hand side, we are financing domestic gasification with EU money, and on the other hand side, we're phasing out gas with EU money again. So maybe we should stop the financing of domestic gasification. That's one. And the second point, which is more important, that I would like to make is that we believe that we have a future as a gas producer in Bulgaria, and we should continue our exploration of Hannes-Peruch block, because in Turkey and in Romania, there were very significant quantities of gas found. Our block is in the middle. We believe that there is a prospect there, and I hope that we do well by the end of the year in that prospect. We have already promised, our party has already promised that we would, if we are in government, we would participate through the Bulgarian Energy Holding in that consortium to support the exploration well, which should be done by the end of the year. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was great and a good takeaway. So as far as I understand, Bulgaria is going to try to, and we can discuss this later on, hopefully in 10 or 15 minutes of discussion. This will be over time. But this tension that Melanie mentioned between global demand and supply, that's going to be still there. And I saw gas demand growing. Doesn't really spell out that there will be a gas exit, but this might change as we saw in the coming days. Now it's my pleasure to turn the floor to Professor Dimitri Ladas, who is a consultant at the Facets Consulting Company, which is active in matters of sustainability, energy, and environment, and focuses on green growth. He has been a full professor at the Athens University, a university in the USA, and also the first president of the Hellenic Center for Renewable Energy Sources. Dimitri, if I could please ask you to limit yourself to 45 minutes, that will be great. And I hope that we could hear, because I can see your mouth moving, but actually can't hear any sound.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the 45 minutes you just gave me. I was planning on finishing in 5, but since you give me 45, I can start saying various stories. But anyway,
I said 4 or 5. Thank you.
Anyway, just to make it feel a little bit easy, I only have one slide. Okay. Let me start by saying a few things about what happened in Greece in 2022, because 2022 was an exceptional year, as we all know, okay? Imports increased from 78 terawatt hours to 86 terawatt hours. LNG increased substantially from 25 to 38, 40% up. Of that LNG, the US had the lion's share. Its share was about 50%. It's now way higher because their imports almost doubled. Now, with that picture in mind, then if we look at what happened to that, all that natural gas that was imported, the exports went from 7 in 2021 to 29 terawatt hours in 2022. Most of it went to Bulgaria, but at the same time, Russian imports more or less stayed constant, and there might be a suspicion that some of that imports from Russia went back to Bulgaria, which was cut off from Russian supply. Anyway, and then what happened in internal consumption? Households in the tertiary sector were down 19%. Industry stayed more or less the same, and electricity generation went from 48 to 41 terawatt hours. So what happened was, with that point of view, it would be very interesting to see how the future would look like, and especially the short-term future. Now, the Greece, as you have heard in a number of from a number of speakers as well, has indeed gone ahead and produced a substantial infrastructure. And so, if I may share my screen. And I did not put it in full display so that you can be assured that there's only one slide. This is what's happened, what has been happening in Greece in the last years, and what is going to continue to happen in the future. The FSRU in Alexandroupolis was already mentioned. It is expected that it will start operating at the end of this year, or possibly in January or February of next year at the latest. There's another FSRU that has also been moving ahead, which is the Dioriga FSRU down in the south, a little bit south of Athens. The final investment decision is expected to take place this year. So that the probability that that will also be built is very, very, very high. A third FSRU has gone through all the permitting process outside of Thessaloniki, and it's that final investment decision is not expected to take place this year, possibly, but most likely in 2024. So, and there's an additional FSRU planned for Volos, but that is way behind in the chain of construction. It is clear that the capacity for LNG going through Greece is going to be much larger, and clearly will definitely cover all of Greece and possibly a large portion of the needs of both Eastern and Western Balkans. Now, what is interesting is to look at our system and see whether all this is feasible or not. The Greek natural gas TSO, which is called DESFA, has announced about a month ago its 2023 to 2032 rolling development plan. 1.24 billion it's costed at. And what it includes is the following. First of all, a doubling of the capacity from the Athens basin up to Thessaloniki. A doubling of the capacity from Thessaloniki to Comontini and the IGP. That capacity is also, as you can see, it's going to be a green light, which means that it will be 100% hydrogen ready. So at least that answers one question about whether that capacity can also be used for hydrogen transportation. The FSRUs, both the Ori one and the Alexandroupolis, are also hydrogen ready, not 100%, but at least 50%. So that is an additional factor that needs to be taken into account in trying to see how all this infrastructure is going to work. The rolling plan also has the connection to North Macedonia that Ambassador already mentioned. A pipeline from Macedonia, or from Thessaloniki to West Macedonia, the Ptolemais Valley, where now the majority of lignite plants are located, where the power corporation is already planning to build more than 500 megawatts of solar to be used possibly to generate hydrogen. So that is also going to be a link that is going to work both ways, and an additional link to cover the needs of Peloponnesus in southern Greece. So in essence, the system that is being built is indeed a very large system. It certainly covers Greece in any kind of estimation of what the inland needs will be. And there still leaves a lot of added capacity for export. And that is what is envisioned. Now, at the same time, it is interesting to note and mention that all these FSRUs are connected with a natural gas power station that is either being built or is planned to be built. So why? Because that is going to replace the lignite capability, which is supposed to finish operating by 2028. Still, even with those power plants, we will have a substantial margin for export through our both the LNG terminals, but also the pipelines, TAP, and the connection to TAP from Turkey. So yes, indeed, Greece will be in position to do that. The question is whether all those investment will take place, because the interesting thing is that some of those investments are still to make final investment decision. And so 2023 will be a very crucial year to see what happens, because the stranded investment question mark that was already mentioned a couple of times is a valid one for Greece and all the infrastructure that is being built right now. And to continue with that, DESFA, in its 10-year power plant, envisions that its customers will go from 600,000 connections to 1 million connections. In its estimate of inland demand, it is almost double between what the demand is now and what is going, with their estimation, to be in 2030. But the Greek government produced a draft, new updated NECP in about a month ago, in which the 2030 demand is not the 86 terawatt in the inland demand, is not the 86 terawatt that the DESFA plans for, but rather almost half of it, 36 terawatt hours. So there is a discontinuity between those two estimates, and it is very interesting to see, as somebody said, we're going to be using funds to build infrastructure, but also we're going to be using funds to reduce consumption. And it is very interesting to see where this balance eventually will become reality. And not to mention that the next 2 or 3 years where all these final decisions for investment will take place are very, very crucial. But at the same time, we're going through elections as well. And with that uncertainty, I wonder whether some of those decisions might be postponed or even given up entirely as far as the economic viability of these additional investments will take place. We will be living in a very interesting period, and I think 2023 will be very crucial by the end of which we'll know which way to go. But clearly, the business of reducing consumption is critical. With that reduction, clearly, the use of Russian gas will become redundant, and at the same time, clearly, the extra capacity that has already been built can provide indeed the technical support for the Russian gas not to be a critical part of the energy mix in the Balkans. So thank you, and I hope I stayed below the 6 minutes that you are, or the 4 or 5 minutes that you allocated.
Thank you, Dimitris. It was around the 10 minutes, but that was interesting, and thanks for that. It's interesting, and I will ask our audience here and online, and thank you for the patience. And also thank you for the participation if you decide or should leave. We have one last speaker, and also we have some questions to answer. So probably we're gonna have a full half-hour extension. But I want to thank you very much. I think it's a really very interesting discussion. With that, I have the pleasure to turn the floor now to Radu Dudau, a co-founder and director of Energy Policy Group and a good partner of CSD. Radu, clearly, no, I wasn't going to talk. I was assuming that you're going to be brief, but clearly Romania, Melanie showed in the slide that Romania has been the biggest seen the biggest reduction in gas supply, and still is also one of the is actually the only local producer of gas so far. The question is, how do you see this tension between still staying in gas, while making the transition, while at the same time preventing stranded assets? Radu, thank you.
All right. So brevity is the order of the day now. The injustice of being lost. But I'll try to focus on things that perhaps haven't been said. So for Southeastern Europe, LNG hasn't been really a regional matter until very recently, basically with this new piece of infrastructure, which you'd wonder why it took it so long to have it, the Greece-Bulgaria gas interconnector. So it's been basically about pipelines, and most of the piped gas was Russian gas with some Caspian gas. Now with the looming prospect of a complete shutdown of Russian exports, that is the remaining 10 odd BCM flowing through the Turk line system underneath the Black Sea from Russia could come to a halt. I mean, you have to take that into consideration. Countries in the region, but also the Western Balkans, more generally, are scrambling for alternatives, and Europe too is looking at the Caspian, for instance, at Azerbaijan in particular, as a potential source that could increase production. LNG through Greece has been, of course, very welcome. All the countries in the region have bought LNG, including Romania, from Greece, but then the limited transport capacity to the north, that will be very contended. So, yeah, what can you do then? There is a tension between the short-term imperative for energy security and the longer-term, mainly climate-driven policy of the EU. That's one thing I wanted to emphasize, and this also explains why you don't act. Why we're seeing this hesitation on the European side to close long-term gas contracts that these providers actually need. They want to invest in new gas fields or expand production capacity and also shipping capacity. And for all of that, for all that, Europe has a very narrow time frame. We're looking at 2025, 2026, just beyond the current gas prices. But further on, we assume the European Green Deal will have fallen in line. Everything will have come in place, and the 2030 targets will have been met. But then 2040 will have to see a drastic reduction of greenhouse gas emission in the EU in order to meet the net zero by 2050. So it's the writing is on the wall. How much can you rely on external gas providers, and for how long? For Romania in particular, one game changer may well be the gas finds in the Black Sea that were mentioned. It's likely, judging by the press releases, that this late spring, early summer, we'll see an announcement of the final investment decision of the consortium there to develop those fields, and probably starting 2027, I'd say 2028, 4 BCM, then 6, and then a maximum of 8 BCM per year, plateauing for about 1 decade over the 2030s, will come online. There's going to be a market for that, no question. Other things, factors that maybe go against a more bullish view about gas development are the fact that gas is very expensive. So investors are taking that into consideration. We've seen a reduction of industrial consumption of gas over the past year, and this will probably some industries will not be so present anymore in Europe. Actually, the lower part of the value chain and the chemicals, fertilizers are very likely lost to other jurisdictions with much more favorable costs for the feedstock, for natural gas. For households, as mentioned, and we analyzed as well for Romania, heat pumps should make a difference in the coming years. It's just that the regulatory environment is not there, but the business case is there. It's a mature technology. It should develop much more quickly, and it could diminish massively domestic consumption. I'll close by saying that other parts of our energy systems will make a difference as well. Romania is a country with nuclear ambitions. New reactors are planned, both classical 2 new units and small modular reactors. And that, of course, will affect the layout, the entire energy mix. So, and then Bulgaria is also on the same page in terms of nuclear ambitions. We'll have to see what comes of that in terms of the economics of these projects and how much sense it makes to put this money and where the financial sources will be. But these are, I think, the factors that are in favor and maybe against the development of the gas industry in our part of the world. I'd say the bottom line is there is definitely potential for energy efficiency, and then gradually getting rid of gas, especially in households and buildings. That's what I foresee for the next 3 to 4, 5 years. That will become really visible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radu. For those who stayed online and in the hall, there is 10 minutes bonus for questions and answers. So if there is any question in the room, I'd like you to post it now. Yes, please, if you could present yourself for the audience online and be brief. Thank you.
Julian Ivanov, the Collins Group. Ruslan, thank you so much for the wonderful conference, and thanks for the presentation, especially for the Constanza presentation as well. I have 2 questions to Yvonne, if she's still online, and it's more related to the energy transition, if you allow me, because the subject for today is the natural gas. I mean, I still don't know if she's online.
Please go on with your question,
Yeah.
and we'll turn it later on. If she's
Okay,
online, she'll
thank you.
answer. If not, we'll ask the other speakers too.
Following the presentation of Yvonne, she mentioned about a huge amount of funding for the energy transition and decarbonization. The first question is regarding the innovation fund. What is the expectation? Most of the projects should be provided by the states or can be by the private sector as well. And the second question, it's having in mind the still big gap, let's say, in the innovation between Europe and United States. Having this proposed funding, is there a clear vision that the Green Deal for Europe will be real, having in mind the situation in Germany, thermal power plants coming back? And if I give an example regarding the energy storages, let's say Nordvolt, it's in a financial trouble, British Gas in bankruptcy, Germany Volt, it's again in trouble. Therefore, the United States subsidize a lot of the production facilities, including the energy storages. Therefore, is there a real belief that European Green Deal will be competitive on a global base? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will turn it to Yvonne, and then I will ask, we have another question to Peter and Melanie, and we will close it out. Yvonne, thank you so much for staying with us. We appreciate that very, very much. Please, if you could squeeze it in 3 minutes, that will be great, but I think it follows greatly on what you already mentioned about the Innovation Fund, and of course the question about it was mentioned a couple times, can we do the green transition and stay competitive and innovative vis-a-vis the US and actually China increasingly? Yvonne, thank you again. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruslan. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to stay on and listen to all the interesting presentations. So no problem on that. I can be very brief on the Innovation Fund. This is in fact for private sector projects, but we encourage national focal points to also talk, to their companies and the sectors to prepare in a way the projects. Also, my colleagues here in DG Climate Action, but also in our agency that implements the program, do a lot of outreach. They have information days, they explain the criteria, what is needed, etc. And then also when a project is handed in, there is feedback as to whether or not the project was good enough, because there's a lot of technical criteria that need to be met and also financial maturity criteria. So I know it's always, in order to get money from any EU fund, and here we're looking at excellence. The basis for the Innovation Fund is really excellence when it comes to clean energy and clean technologies. But definitely private sector interest is what we want. And yeah, we've started seeing the first projects also in the southeastern region, so that is great. Then on the bigger question almost, yeah, the gap in EU-US funding. I would just like to very briefly, because as you said, Ruslan, I've tried to maybe more indirectly already refer to it. If you look at the different components and not just the funding, in Europe, we have been having over the last decades a very stable regulatory framework, which provides for, on the one hand, supply, on the other hand, demand. And this is extremely important. I don't think we should underestimate that. We have also a fairly stable carbon price. And this, of course, interacts with the regulatory environment. So we've just finished our Fit for 55 package. We've revised the emissions trading system, and the carbon price is here to stay. So that, in a way, also enters into the financial picture of any investment. You will avoid the carbon price if you don't have to pay for those allowances. Then, yeah, you also need to look at the stability. So in a way, the question about, is the European Green Deal real? I would definitely answer yes, as in it is here to stay. And I think the war in Ukraine has also been, how shall I say, an additional factor to make people realize that we're not going to go back to an economy fueled on fossil fuels. We're not going to do that. We want our energy independence and we want the clean energy transition. So, this is the trajectory we're on, and we will stay onto it. And I think we've proven, throughout COVID, throughout the very, very high energy prices, that this is what we're headed towards. Now, the competitiveness is, of course, an important issue. And I think that is where you see that indeed also at EU level, but it needs to be complemented by national measures. We're trying to ensure this competitiveness. And I mentioned the Net Zero Industry Act, but what I maybe didn't mention, but it's also an important element, is the crisis framework for state aid. The Temporary Crisis and Transition Framework, I think it's called the TCTF, where, of course, exactly again, for the same type of technologies, member states are really kind of encouraged to provide support. But again, all this hangs together. We make it possible at EU level, but we want member states to also put very clear policies in place that combine the energy challenges, if you want, with this mid to long-term perspective and vision, also on the climate agenda, because otherwise you will end up having, investments which maybe go into things that are not going to be able to be very useful for very long. And that is, of course, in a way, a waste of money, waste of private sector money, but also waste of taxpayers' money. And I think we have many other issues that we can rather put that money into. So, yeah, I mentioned, the person who asked the question mentioned Germany, but I try to indicate that, yes, there has been a short-term shift to coal here and there, but also Germany is trying to rectify that. I think they have, or they are in the process of putting very strong national policies in place, notably, for example, on heat pumps. So that is something, yeah, we encourage everybody to kind of learn from each other and to have this combination of, EU policies and funds, national policies and funds, and support for the transition and the technologies that are part of that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Indeed, and thanks again, once again, for staying with us and for your great intervention. I think it's very clear that the green transition is happening. At least there is agreement on that in all the major economic centers. It's not just Europe, but also the US and China. The question on the channels, or the swiftness of what's going on, and will be decided, and I think that this is decided now. I wanted to finish with giving the floor very briefly to first Peter, because we have a specific question from Vladislava Kožuharova about the idea of local extraction. Politicians are keen on investments, but I know that the IEA has advised no new gas fields to be developed if we are to remain within climate targets. Has this changed, or is this about to change? And then I will finish with the same question to Melanie just shortly. Peter?
Thank you, and I'll try and be brief on that. But the short answer is no, that hasn't changed. The net zero transition scenario globally by 2050 implies no new investments because demand falls so rapidly. And so basically, if you believe that that's going to happen, then there's no further need for upstream investments. Now, of course, we recognize that the context has changed considerably and that energy security concerns are now top of the political agenda. And so one of the arguments we make is that long lead time conventional projects are not a good fit to plug the supply shortfall, simply because they take many years to approve and to bring to first production. So if there is supply that needs to come online to cover shortfalls, then the emphasis should really be on short cycle projects and projects that have the lowest emissions intensity as possible. That avoids stranded asset risks. It ensures that the emissions intensity of the oil and gas that's supplied is as low as it possibly can be. And it also ensures that there are no long lead time projects that really last far beyond the period under which there might be a shortfall. But currently, with the demand projected in the NZE, there's really no requirement for additional upstream investment.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to, if Melanie is still online, I would like to turn the floor to her for final words, because I stopped her in a little bit short of her ending. Melanie, I saw in your presentation that besides the gap between demand and supply, so tightness of the market, I thought I saw also a short-term increase in that demand. What would be your reaction in terms of, what would you advise politicians in terms of not to get stranded assets? If you could hear me, the floor is yours for a final 1 minute response.
Sorry, I had my computer up to my ear. Okay, so I could sort of hear your question. Now, now I can turn my camera on. And I did mention stranded investments, but I also mentioned the need for thoughtful, sequenced policies. It is clear what we have seen from the Russian invasion in Ukraine that natural gas is a very critical component of our energy security, of our economic development, et cetera, and that we cannot just turn off natural gas immediately and without affecting all of those things I just described. And so again, the need for thoughtful, sequenced policies that get us to net zero, which I think is critical, but does it in a way that we accommodate the energy security, economic needs, and quite frankly, regional needs as well. I showed you the difference between Bulgaria's gas consumption and Greece's gas consumption. It's different impacts on different countries, even within the EU, very, very different impacts. And I would say that we owe the investment community some clear signals. We need you to invest now in pipelines, but we're going to strand your assets. It's not a signal you want to be sending to an investment community. And so it's incumbent upon the governments to send the signals and develop those policies that it's a very complicated policy making, but we've got to be thoughtful and clear about all of this. And I'd say one other thing that we tend to forget, that climate change is a global issue. And I looked at, for this discussion, looked at obviously huge regions, countries in the world, India and China. China, 63% of their power generation is coal. 73%, or I'm making this up, but close, of India's power generation is coal. IEA also did an analysis showing about the emissions reductions you get from switching from coal to gas. And so switching from coal to gas in those countries gets you significant emissions reductions. And we can't lose sight of the fact that that's important as well. And then I'd finally say something about technology limitations, that we did a study of California in 1 year. These are data, not modeling, actual data. California had 90 days with no wind. It had 10 days in a row with no wind. Battery storage right now is 4 hours. We don't have the technologies to accommodate that intermittency yet. And to Yvonne's point, investment in innovation is hugely important. And all of these things have to be brought together in thoughtful policies. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. I think it's a wonderful final of our today's conference. Thank you so much to all of you here in the hall, stayed with us late in the evening. You know, we typically end up exactly on time, but I think it was worth it. And we look forward to welcoming you in the future. Thanks also for the colleagues online, and we look forward to our next discussions. Again, it's very critical for our region to get this discussion right so that we don't have, land in stranded assets and that we make the transition just right, knowing that we are a investment poor region. We have to be very careful with how we invest our money and how we direct private investment. Thank you very much. Thanks for the colleagues for organizing this conference from the Energy and Climate Program at CSD. And we look forward to having you in our next events. Thank you so much. And I think we deserve a round of applause for everyone here. Thank you.